Well, and then just diversifies their economy tremendously if they can absorb that.
The other thing, about Russia having no debt and the economic status of Russia, the median income in Russia is like $18,000 or something. They live on less, everything costs less. They're just kind of on a different scale from the U.S. and they have no debt. There's no
I didn't know
national
that.
debt. So if everyone cut Russia off, they could fight this war for 50 years before they run out of money. We're spending $1 million to manufacture a high precision rocket, and they're spending like 30 grand just because they're paying people less, but everything costs less there. They got like 3% income tax because they're a petro state.
I didn't know any of that.
You'll learn so much from Wendover.
Yeah, Wendover's a cool channel. It's really well edited.
Yeah, high quality production stuff.
Very digestible. So, did everybody have a chance to read the essay "Responding to the Argument from Evil"?
Mm-hmm.
This was there was a lot in here. It was packed with stuff. Did anybody have a chance to see David Wood's testimony?
Is he that one that was a psychopath?
Yeah.
He was weird. I watched
You
that.
watched the
He
testimony?
was scary, and I saw he had a wedding band, and who in their right mind would have married him?
Someone married me.
He's a nice guy. He's had an interesting past, but I mean, he's found the Lord.
And it's got the book.
I could definitely hear his voice as I was reading this essay. It has his tone to it. So the three approaches to, well, I guess first of all, maybe one thing that would be potentially confusing is the argument from evil. Like, that's kind of a weird way to refer to it, but I mean, that's what some call it, the argument from evil. I've often heard it called the problem of evil. Like, well, the problem of evil is that it's a problem for people who believe in God, that there happens to be this, abundance of unpleasant things. Like, if God is, like he says here in, on page 37, God is by definition all-knowing, all-powerful, and completely good. And if he's all-knowing, he would know how to prevent bad things from happening. If he's all-powerful, he would have the power to prevent bad things from happening. If he's completely good, he would want to prevent bad things from happening. Yet bad things happen, so therefore, that's a problem for belief in God, right?
No. Before apologetics, I always thought of it as a childish perspective before I actually knew what the philosophical answer to that is. But my understanding of it was, well, okay, if we believe in God, well, what does God say? We're separated from God, right? We sinned. We ate of the fruit. So, yes, God is all good, but it's like the first thing in the Bible, the first thing that happens. Yeah, we were separated from that, so we're left to our own devices. So, like, the only way out of that argument is determinism, So if you don't believe in determinism, it's a self-answering question. Yeah, God is all good, and he does know how to prevent it, but just like I know how to prevent my kids from getting hurt, I don't, because they need to learn.
True.
All right, tell me what determinism is.
There's a subsect of people, is it Dawkins? He's a determinist?
Let's see.
I think Dawkins is
I'm not sure.
the most...
He might be.
So determinism is the belief that everything is predetermined. Like, you didn't actually make the choice, because if you look down on time from a perspective outside of time, you're already born, alive, and dead at the same time, because you're outside of time. It's just like words in a book. And their belief is you didn't make the decision to run that red light. It was predetermined that you were going to do it. That's why you did it. It
So
wasn't
free
your
will
choice.
is an illusion.
Yeah, it's the antithesis to free will.
Now, what do you mean born out of time?
So, God exists outside of time. So some of these, in my opinion, some of these things are easier to think about, even though we couldn't possibly conceptualize it, from the concept of what if you were looking at people inside of time if you were outside of time? If you're outside of time, you were born at a certain time, you live during a certain time, and you die at a certain time. But if you're looking down on it from outside of time, you see it all at once. people exist and don't exist all at the same time.
It's like reading a novel, okay, that you've read before. Say you've read it 3 or 4 times, know it inside out, okay. The people in the novel, the characters in the novel, are still living through this existence and this thing. Every time you read it, they're don't know the future. They're living within that structure, okay. But as a reader that has read it before, you know what's going to happen and all of that. Okay, did you make that happen? Yeah, that's part of the different answer.
It's a beautiful analogy to what determinism looks like. Everything's already written down. It already happened. You're just experiencing it in real time.
Yeah, getting back to the evil thing, it relies on a naive conception of God, in my mind. That's where I place it. It has a naive, simplistic understanding of who God is and what his goals and his
it takes away all the meaning.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean like from the atheist perspective?
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah, it's naive because
Almost
unless
a
you're
straw man argument.
Unless you're a determinist, you believe in free will. You can't have free will and no evil because we're sinful people. We ate of the fruit. It's incongruent. It's illogical.
Right.
Anybody have any questions that just stick out that they want to go over or start diving into?
Well, on page 38, on the second paragraph, when he says, let me see if I can remember how this goes, because he says if there are other problems with the argument, it's shown that there are other problems. And my question was, what are those other problems? Are these the other problems, what they're talking about continuing on, or are there other problems besides this?
Where exactly is that?
Oh, it's right here. It says, based on this inconsistency alone, I would say that if a theist has no explanation for suffering, he or she is no worse off than the atheist who has no explanation for the origin of the universe or for complexity of life. If, however, it can be shown that there are other problems with the argument from evil, meaning, like, if you can show that there are problems with saying, oh, well, God must not exist because evil is a thing, and if theists offer other reasons for God to allow suffering, then we're on much better ground for God's existence than atheists or skeptics are, because they have fewer arguments and evidences.
They're stuck on step 1.
Well, when I reread this last night and looking at what the other reasons are, I wasn't sure if this was the continuing essay is what he intended as the other.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So essentially what he's saying is, even if we concede that evil is a problem for Christianity, which we don't have to, but even if we do say, you know what, yeah, you're right. The fact that we have evil is a problem, but that is such a limited scope in your evidence for whether or not there is a God, because there's so many other greater evidences that point to God. So sure, even if we say, yeah, it's a problem that evil exists, it's so vastly outweighed by all these other arguments that it's like, it's not really that big of a problem, because we have to admit that we are finite creatures. We have limited perspective in time and space, and we can't say that, oh, just because I can't see what reasons God could have for, allowing evil and suffering, doesn't mean that he doesn't actually have good reasons for allowing evil and suffering. So the point that he's making is that if, however, it can be shown that there are other problems with the argument from evil, and if we can offer other reasons for God to allow suffering, then we're in a much better position than just to say, oh, well, evil and suffering exist, therefore God doesn't exist. Like it's a weak argument, because we have so many other things to tip the balance, outweigh that
Well,
case.
see, that's what didn't come to mind, is what are those other arguments?
Well, he names several. One of them we actually haven't covered in Evidence for God, but we did cover in On Guard, and that is the fine tuning of the universe. So he says,
Okay, he talks about that.
he doesn't really go into it, but he says design arguments, and he just kind of lumps everything under that. And I can clarify that. But what he's saying, this outweighing the argument from evil is one of the approaches. And he's saying, okay, sure, yeah, let's concede that evil is a problem. But have you considered there's this huge, vast mountain of other things that you're not considering that vastly outweigh the problem of evil? And one of them is the fine-tuning of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
So within apologetics and philosophy, there's this kind of genre or school of thought called teleology, which is the idea that we observe things in nature that give the very strong appearance that they were designed. Like, that just couldn't have happened by chance. Like, how could that have happened by chance? It clearly has design. And we talked about that last semester in like the origin of life, certain things that give the appearance of design in biology. Like there was a bacteria that has like a flagellum that's like this really intricate machine. It's like there's such intricacy and elegance in it that it's like that. I don't see how that could have been happened by chance. What he's talking about here in the design argument, really the granddaddy of all design arguments, in my opinion, is the fine-tuning of the universe. When he says there's no naturalistic explanation for why these values should be just right for life, the fine-tuning of the cosmos provides strong evidence for designing intelligence. So the fine-tuning of the universe basically says that our universe exists in such a way that if it were just a teeny tiny bit different, we couldn't have life at all.
Mm-hmm.
So you've probably heard that, if the Earth were just 6 inches closer to the sun, we'd all burn up. Or if we were just 6 inches farther away from the sun, we'd all freeze to death, right? That's just the tip of the iceberg. The chances of the universe existing the way that it does, that allows for life to exist at all, not just life, but chemistry and gravity and physics and all of that stuff, is 1 times 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, meaning like the odds are if you spray painted a single atom red, and then you had a spaceship that could go through 100 billion different universes just like our own, and imagine how enormous our universe is, and you went through 100 billion universes just like ours, and you just happened to find that one atom spray painted red.
But only looking at one atom.
Yeah, and you only get to look. You only get to look at one atom. It's not like, you go, oh, no, not this one. Oh, no, not this one. Oh, no, not this one. Like, literally, let's this one. Oh, yeah, here it is. It's the red one. maybe a better analogy. I'm actually borrowing this analogy from the prophecies of Jesus Christ, but Lee Strobel has said that just 8 of the prophecies that came true about Jesus, which there were hundreds, but if you just said 8 of them came true, the chances of that would be like if you covered the entire surface of the planet Earth with little 1/4-inch tiles, and one of them had a gold star on the other side, and you walked the whole planet and you were given the opportunity to turn one tile over, what are the chances that you would find the 1 1/4-inch tile with a gold star on it? Those are the same odds that Jesus had fulfilled 8 of the hundreds of prophecies that were true of him. That's nothing compared to the chances of our universe existing the way that it does, such that we could even have life of any kind, much less, complex, intelligent life that permits us to have, apologetics classes on Sunday morning.
Now, what book would you suggest I read to learn a little bit more about what you just shared?
On Guard has a fantastic chapter about it. We could talk about the fine-tuning argument more if you'd like.
I'm sure everybody else is more familiar with it than I am, but
Not
you're
really.
not too?
It's still fascinating, regardless.
It is fascinating, and I would like to be able to speak more intelligently about it.
So, Oh, go ahead, keep going.
Do what?
Oh no, on the big numbers to kind of help grasp that. There's different numbers that they used, but so Borel's law says any odds beyond 1 in 1,050 have a 0 probability of ever happening. I've heard other ones that they're a little bigger, but the number that John shared, it's phenomenally long. You can't even fathom, you can't understand it.
We could watch the fine tuning video real quick.
What was the number that he gave?
1,050?
Yeah.
Yeah, what that is a statistical threshold, meaning that statisticians look at a probability, and anything that's smaller than this certain threshold, they just consider it 0 because.
The word they use is statistically insignificant.
Yeah.
Don't think about it. You know, in engineering, they have something called first principles, where say you start building cars, and then you look at everyone else that does something that you want to do, and they all do it the same. And instead of saying, all right, that's how we're going to do it, the first principles way of looking at it is, well, why do they do it, right? Maybe they all do it because everyone else has always done it that way. Maybe there's a better way to do it. And, you know, the fine tuning of the universe, I don't feel is even the first step. You know, that's the second step. The first step is the fact that the universe even exists.
Right.
Because their argument is in the beginning there was nothing, which exploded.
Which is true.
Yeah. I heard a funny comedian recently. I don't want to play it because he has some curse words, but he was talking about there's two different people. There's the people that believe that we're created, right? The Big Bang was a creator. Then we have people that believe we came from nothing, and nothing created everything.
Well, that's impossible.
Yeah. It's
Well, they'll just say that we just don't understand.
yeah.
No one understands.
No one
And
understands.
then he says, when you ask them, well, how happens when you die? And they go, well, nothing. You return to nothing. He's like, well, if nothing created everything, then you return to your creator? That was clever. So, yeah.
Tell me that again.
So they're the school of thought, the people that believe that the Big Bang and everything came from nothing.
Yeah.
It just popped into existence. You ask them, what happens after you die? Nothing. You just go into nothing. There's nothing after death. So if you follow that through logically, you're returning to nothing. If nothing created everything, you're returning to the creator.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
their God is
It's a
nothing.
funny pun, but it's not a very strong point because it's making a categorical error.
Well, it's just interesting. On guard, ENGUARD.
Yeah, the material is on Defenders Apologetics.
If you want to use this, record.
Oh, sure. I don't know if this one will be long enough.
This one will be.
Yeah, that'll definitely be long enough.
You think you're ready for this?
I need to get one of these.
Okay, is this one?
Doesn't he talk about teleology in here? Oh, no, he talks about theodicy.
Theodicy is an
Theodicy.
Yes. Theodicy and teleology often get confused because they sound so similar. Theodicy is a word that TV's going on.
Oops.
That was devised by Leibniz, actually, the guy who said, why is there something rather than nothing? And it's just it's an explanation for why God permits evil. The TV's not connecting. Are we on the right?
So that's the whole purpose of that word there, is just to explain why God permits evil.
Yes.
Theodicy does that.
It's like a religious argument, basically.
Okay.
Hello, computer.
There's 10 to the power of 50.
Which is still nothing compared to the odds of the universe existing. We're still not getting anything from the TV. What's going on?
There
Oh,
it comes. There it comes.
Just really slow.
Yeah.
He's thinking.
So a theodicy is an attempt to explain why God permits evil. That's all. We're not really like. I don't think that we should make such attempts to like fully explain comprehensively why. I mean, that's just not our job. I do think that a much better position to take would be that we to recognize that we don't have the ability to see everything from every angle, and admit that God probably does have good reasons for why he allows things to happen the way that he does. I would argue that someone who attempts to make a theodicy isn't really practicing the intellectual humility of admitting that they're not God. I don't have all the answers. I don't know why. There's a book that I wanted to show you called God and the Problem of Evil. This is basically just 5 essays addressing the problem of evil from different perspectives. There's a classic view, there's the Molinist view, open theist view, essential kenosis view, and skeptical theist view. And one of them, the way he opens his essay is just like, I can't believe he's saying that. I think it's the essential kenosis view. He says,
While you're looking, I think it's good to realize that if we start with the ambiguous terms in the book, so if you consider the word good, they say God is wholly good, but what do we mean by this? Theists or atheists and the people who believe they'll have different meanings to different words. They'll have different completely worldviews and different assumptions completely that they're going to bring into their thought process. So they list some stuff out here. If God exists, he would maximize their pleasure and minimize their pain. Mm-hmm. Our pleasure is not maximized and our pain is minimized, thus God does not exist. Well, where does that thought that God wants to maximize our pleasure come from? Never says that.
right.
That's something that's their own God they created in their head. So if their God doesn't exist, sure.
Good point.
But they have these assumptions. They call them presuppositions, but assumptions they bring to the argument, to the conversation. And it's using that basis, kind of their worldview, their thoughts. They're anchored in these things they assume.
One of the things that is, I think, very basic to all of what we're discussing is the premises from which we start are critical to any of our arguments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We like that's a perfect example. God wants us to be maximize their pleasure and minimize their pain. Well, if you accept someone's argument or premise, then your argumentation is going to be flawed. So it's critical to look at the premises and start with that and analyze the initial premise before you get into the argument.
Yeah, start with define good. If you don't
Right.
believe in God, my definition is probably different than yours.
Mm-hmm.
And that permeates into not just the way people think of God and evil, but into education, different sciences and everything that you could think of. And for example, in science and biology, they have this presupposition that evolution is 100% true. So when they come across something that's incongruent, well, they're trying to explain it away in evolution and not what it actually is. So cram it into, well, that stuff doesn't align with what we think, so that's just it's not real. It just must be.
That's an outlier.
It's an outlier. Yeah.
Mm.
So this is a video from On Guard, and I think it's incredibly relevant to what we're talking about right now, which is the logical, or I mean not the logical, the probabilistic version of the problem of evil. So in On Guard, we talked about how there's actually three kinds of the problem of evil and suffering. There's the emotional, and then there's the intellectual. And within the intellectual, there's the logical and the probability version. So the logical version says that God cannot exist because evil exists. Evil and suffering and God are mutually exclusive. They cannot exist. And we can get into that today if you'd like. But really what we're discussing from this essay is the probability version or evidential version, meaning that I see so much evil and suffering in the world, therefore God probably doesn't exist. And so we've identified a lot of inconsistencies and ambiguities in that argument. So let's take a look at this. That hopefully will help clarify some of that.
Version of the problem of suffering and evil. This argument attempts to show that since suffering and evil exist, it is logically impossible for God to exist. And we explained why even atheist philosophers admit that this argument fails. But wait, it may still be argued that while it's logically possible that God and suffering both exist, is far from likely. There's just so much pointless suffering, it seems improbable that God could have good reasons for permitting it. This is the probability version of the problem. Suffering provides empirical evidence that God's existence is not impossible, just highly unlikely. Is this a good argument? Consider 3 points. First, we are not in a position to say with any confidence that God probably lacks reasons for allowing the suffering in the world. The problem is that we're limited in space and time, and in intelligence and insight. God, on the other hand, sees every detail of history from beginning to end, and orders it through people's free decisions and actions. In order to achieve his purposes, God may have to allow a great deal of suffering along the way. Suffering which appears pointless within our limited scope of understanding may be seen to have been justly permitted by God within his wider framework. Sometimes, what we experience makes no sense until we gain a wider perspective and see the big picture designed by the Creator. Here's the second point. Relative to the full scope of the evidence, God's existence may well be probable. You see, probabilities are always relative to background information. For example, if we consider only how much this man weighs, we would say it's highly improbable that he's a world-class athlete. But when we're willing to consider new information, that he's a professional sumo wrestler and a world champion, we quickly revise our view. In the same way, when the atheist claims that God's existence is improbable, we should ask, improbable relative to what background information? If we consider only the suffering in the world, then God's existence may very well appear to be improbable. But if we're willing to look at the full scope of background information, to take into account the powerful arguments for God's existence, we may come to a very different conclusion. The third point is, Christianity entails doctrines that increase the probability of the coexistence of God and suffering. Consider 4 of these. First, the chief purpose of life is not happiness. People often assume that if God exists, his role is to create a comfortable environment for his human pets. They think the ultimate goal of our lives on earth is happiness, and therefore, God is obligated to keep us happy. However, Christianity presents a radically different view, that the purpose of life is to know God. This alone brings true, lasting fulfillment. Suffering can bring about a deeper, more intimate knowledge of God, either on the part of the one who is suffering or those around him. The whole point of human history is that God, having given us free will, is drawing as many people as he can into his unending kingdom. Suffering is one of the ways God can draw people freely to himself. In fact, countries that have endured the most hardship often show the highest growth rates for Christianity.
God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world.
Second, mankind is in a state of rebellion against God and his purpose. Terrible human evils are testimony to man's depravity, a consequence of his alienation from God. The Christian isn't surprised at moral evil in the world. On the contrary, he expects it.
That's what Igor was saying.
The third doctrine states that God's purpose is not restricted to this life, but spills over beyond the grave into eternal life. This world is just the beginning, the entryway to an unimaginable, never-ending life beyond death's door. Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, underwent afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, hunger. Yet he wrote, "We do not lose heart, for this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Because we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." Paul understood that life on earth, and whatever suffering it holds for each of us, is temporary. Our pain will not endure forever, but our lives with God will. Paul was not belittling the plight of those who suffer horribly in this life. Indeed, he was one of them. But he saw that those suffering will be overwhelmed forever by the ocean of joy that God will give to those who will freely receive it. And the fourth doctrine is this: the knowledge of God is an incomparable good. Knowing God is the ultimate fulfillment of human existence, an infinite good. Thus, the person who knows God, no matter how much he has suffered, can still say, "God is good to me." So, if Christianity is true, it's not at all improbable that suffering and evil should exist. In summary, for all these reasons, the probability version of the problem of evil is no more successful than the logical version. As a purely intellectual problem, then, the problem of evil does not disprove God's existence. But even if those intellectual arguments fail, the emotional problem of suffering and evil remains very powerful. If you have suffered deeply, or if you've watched someone you love go through intense pain, you may be thinking, so what if God exists? Why would I want to respond to him or worship him? I feel cold and empty. I want nothing to do with him. You're not alone. God knows your name. He knows who you are and what you're going through. God promises to be with you through your suffering. He can give you the strength to endure. Jesus Christ also suffered. Although he was innocent, he was tortured and sentenced to death. His suffering had a purpose: to provide you and me with a life-giving connection to God. Not only does God exist, but he loves you. He seeks after you. He offers you hope. And in time, he will make all things new.
He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.
There's actually two. There's a second part to that. I won't watch it now, but
Well, that was
It's
the
awesome.
second part.
oh, you combined.
No, just the logical problem comes.
Oh, there's two videos.
Yeah.
Like actually two separate videos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the logical version comes first, and then the probabilistic version comes next. The end of the video hopefully serves as a powerful reminder that when you're talking about the problem of evil with somebody, it's likely that they're not really dealing with the intellectual version, but they're dealing with the emotional version. So it's important to be sensitive to that, because we're not trying to win arguments, right? We're trying to show the love of Christ, and so I think before diving into the problem of evil with someone, it's important to recognize, are they dealing with the intellectual version or are they dealing with the emotional version? Because The emotional version is a completely different animal.
That's one thing I'm really bad at because I immediately get stopped at the door of logic. And I don't believe a person can make the argument of if God good, why evil from a logical standpoint. It's always emotional because, my immediate impulse is to be like, well, evil doesn't exist if God doesn't exist. You made that up.
Right.
Right.
And that's what we talked about last week.
So, I watch people have illogical, emotional conversations that lead people to Christ, and I'm like, I disagree with both of you. I think, the person that's suffering that you're talking to is wrong about why they believe that they're suffering and their ideas on evil, and the person who's, delivering their testimony is doing a beautiful thing, but some of the things they're saying, I'm like, well, that's not really biblical either. Yet here they both are. Next thing you know, they're both in church together, hand in hand, and I'm like, I just don't get it.
It's interesting. One of C.S. Lewis's small books, kind of the Narnia series, was A Horse and His Boy. And in that, and it really had a huge impact on me. Just the way he presents and it goes through this young man's travels and all the horrible things that have happened to him over the years and stuff, and all these tragedies and all. And then it presents at the end how God was working in each one of those to lead him to where he is at this point. And it just it points to what he was saying about our limited perspective, and just how we don't see the big picture. We don't see what's really going on. We see just this little tiny little snippet, and with no context of any kind. And but just his portrayal of that was just very powerful. It's it's basically written towards a young audience, but it's relevant to anybody. It's a very powerful statement on just how limited our perspective is and how God's designs are so far above our own.
Right. So I think suffering is one of the consequences of being separated from God.
I lump it in with death. We were cursed to die.
Yep.
It's just part of one of the ways we could die.
I think, and I wanna make sure that get some Bible in here too. But, so in Hebrews, because we know they're suffering, and the Bible doesn't say we're not going to suffer. Now there are different churches and stuff will say the opposite. Say, oh my God doesn't allow suffering, and like big names, evangelists and stuff. But the Bible doesn't say that. In fact, it says the exact opposite of that. In Hebrews 11, verses 32 to 38 or 40, it contrasts the different people in the beginning, which is, I don't want to read the whole thing, I'll paraphrase it, but and what more shall I say? I do not have the time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, and David, and Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of flames, and escaped the edge of the sword. It goes on. Like they were good, they were prosperous, God blessed them, right? Their lives weren't just filled with just suffering. But then it goes on and it contrasts. It says, there were others who were tortured, refused to be released so they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destituted and persecuted and mistreated. So, and then, so 39 says, they were all condemned They're commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. So there you have that stark contrast. You have people who did awesome and were great and they were blessed and got the promise that God promised Abraham and his descendants. And then on the other hand, you have people that are sawn in half and going around sheepskins, and like we would see that as suffering. And so that this is a good example of, right, that they're suffering. There's no promise that we're not going to suffer.
And I think the point there is too, that they were commended by God, even though they weren't rewarded in this lifetime, that God has a plan for them, and there is justice, and there is.
That's a very good point. We may not see his plan or see the justice in our lifetime, but God is good and he will have it.
It's interesting to me, talk about vengeance being bad and all, and God says, vengeance is mine. But it's interesting in Revelation, it talks about, the saints cry out for vengeance to God, to visit vengeance on their enemies and their persecutors. And I think that's interesting. It's not that vengeance is bad, it's that is God's purview and not ours.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of side note.
No, that's good. So there is evil, and we can clearly see evil. So as Christians, we have the benefit of explaining some of it and being able to. We can't fully explain all of it, because sometimes we just don't have an answer for everything. Until we get to heaven. So, there's evil. Some people will say, well, God doesn't exist if there's not evil. Well, the Bible doesn't say, our God doesn't say there's not going to be evil. In fact, the opposite, and now we know what to do when we experience that. In fact, right, they talk about in Romans and in Galatians as well, that suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance, hope, and hope, character, hope. Mm-hmm. If you have someone who's been raised, or someone who goes through a lot of suffering and stuff, right, they'll have a lot of times more character. Right? Or someone who never has any hardships or troubles or nothing, no suffering, they have their characters, right, not built up. Often we call them kind of spoiled, or
I'm a strong believer in suffering. There's no light without darkness. There's no joy without the fears of pain in life. One thing, it's as humans, I feel like it's so difficult for us to step out of our own perspective. And one thing to remember, as a believer in Christ, we were put in this world by God, who is not of this world. He exists outside of our existence, outside of time. And a person that lives a whole life of suffering, to us, is a whole life of suffering. But in the grand scheme of things, this fleeting moment in time, 100 years of existence on this earth, if you're lucky, is so insignificant and so inconsequential that I feel like we should put it into perspective. That we won't remember this life when we're in heaven with God. Is that because it's so inconsequential? It's like having a drink of water, or maybe something even faster, like a flu shot. A flu shot is suffering, but it's 5 seconds and dozens of years of living.
Yeah, it's for a greater good.
What's an eternity of the joy of being with God in exchange for a life that can be blessed and can have suffering, but most likely will have both.
Yeah, so the video that we just watched, I wonder if it had a lot of influence on David Wood writing this essay, because the three approaches that he takes are actually covered in this video. The first one is the problems with the argument from evil are inconsistencies, like, well, I can't see, so therefore, since we can't think of any reasons for allowing certain instances of suffering, some suffering is probably pointless. Therefore, God probably doesn't exist. Well, relative to our, tiny limited scope, God may have, it may appear pointless, but, God may have permitted it justly. And then it also talks about, ambiguous terms for, the point of good, like what is good. If God existed, he would maximize our pleasure and minimize our pain, and since it's not our pleasure is not maximized and our pain is not minimized, thus God doesn't exist. Well, again, the purpose of life is not happiness, it's to know God. The purpose of life is to know God. Like, for me, that was kind of an eye-opener for having right perspective in this, because it's so tempting to think selfishly about what constitutes goodness. Happiness and comfort are goods, but they're not the ultimate good. The purpose of life is to know God, even at the expense of pain and suffering. And then the other thing he talks about, the third approach is outweighing the argument from evil, and that was why I was on this part here, where even if you do concede, oh sure, the pain and suffering is evidence against God's existence, we'll concede just for the sake of argument that's that does make it appear highly unlikely, but relative to all of these other arguments, that it's a drop in the bucket. It's nothing compared to, like we talked about, the fine-tuning argument, the applicability of mathematics, the cosmological argument, which he gives. He talks about the cosmological argument. So that's what right here, this Kalam cosmological argument is given on 41. Whatever begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause. That's literally the Kalam cosmological argument. The argument for morality, that's right there, the moral argument. If God doesn't exist, objective moral values do not exist, but objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. We talked about that last week. And then the design argument is the fine-tuning, which in my opinion is the most compelling, far beyond any, intelligent design. The fine-tuning argument is just so enormous. On guard, we talked about the fine-tuning argument. There are a lot of figures and a lot of numbers thrown out, and it's like, man, how am I ever going to remember any of this? I can show you. In the video from On Guard, they talk about, if the gravitational constant varied by 1 in one part in 10 to the 60th. So they throw all these figures at you, but this one I think is the easiest to remember and probably the most compelling, and that is right here. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to a precision of 1 in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd. Oh, oops. I'll just skip to that.
So I found the other video.
The other problem with the other video?
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers.
That's a lot of figures. I'm
These
not going to remember.
are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry.
It wouldn't even be chemistry.
Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would again be life prohibiting. Or another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge.
So for the interest of time, I'll just stop it there. But the point is, like,
visual there.
yeah, all of a razor's edge, the egg and the pencil, and yeah.
In our other group, we're talking about Genesis and God creating light. Me and Randy were going back and forth, and I was talking about how when darkness and light are separated, the way I understood that, not to speak as to say I know how God did it, I have no idea. The way I visualize it is he made chemistry, because chemistry is the movement of electrons. That is light. I don't understand it as he made the sun and now we have day and night on Earth. I understand it as that. It's fine-tuning the universe that we can
there's a lot implicit
experience
there.
day and night,
Same with time. Like when God created light, implicit in that is also time.
Yeah.
Because light doesn't really behave as light
And space.
without time. Yeah, or space, exactly.
Yeah, it's all of it,
You need somewhere to put it and some time to put it.
Right.
Yeah, I like that.
Did you wanna cover the logical version?
So yeah, I was mistaken. The video we watched is the second one. There's the first part to that. It's the logical one, which I think is also really good. And these videos, all of these videos, you can get them online at Reasonable Faith. We also have an phone app. So all those videos are on there.
Sorry, you were gonna say something?
Yeah, I come back to it.
Okay.
I kind of blanked. Yeah.
So I showed you this slide earlier. There's three versions of the problem of evil. There's the emotional, which just says, I don't like that there's evil and suffering, so therefore I don't think God exists. And I've actually seen that in an interview with Stephen Fry. I don't know if you've seen this, where Stephen Fry, who's a outspoken atheist, is like, you know why I don't believe in God? Bone cancer in children. What's that about? How dare you, God? How dare you? And it's like, well, that's obviously the emotional problem of evil and suffering. But then on the intellectual side, there's two subversions. We looked at the probability version, which says, there's so much evil and suffering, therefore God probably doesn't exist. We're going to take a look now at the logical version, which says that evil and suffering exists, which is totally incompatible with God existing. God and evil can't both exist at the same time. Logically, they're just logically incompatible. Epicurus was the one who formulated this. He's like, if God is willing to prevent evil but not able, then he's not omnipotent. And if he's able but not willing, then he's not good. But if he is both able and willing, then why do we see evil? You can see the logical inconsistency. So the logical problem of evil and suffering says that God and evil are mutually exclusive. You can't have one and the other. You can only have one or the other. And because we have lots of evidence of evil, therefore God must not exist. That's the logical version. So let's take a look at that.
We are all well aware of the suffering and evil in the world. Horrific suffering, unspeakable evil. How then can anyone believe in the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God? And if God does exist, why would anyone want to worship him? Epicurus framed the logical problem of suffering and evil like this. If God is willing to prevent evil, but not able, then he's not all-powerful. If he is able to prevent evil, but not willing, he is not good. But If he is both willing and able, how can evil exist? And if he is neither able nor willing, then why call him God? In other words, it's logically impossible for God and suffering to both exist. But we know full well that suffering exists. Therefore, God does not. Is this a good argument?
Can you pause it?
Let's look at it more closely. Are these
One thing that, with that, just going back to the premises again, okay, if what he says there is logically correct, then the proof that there is both good and evil is proof that the first premise is incorrect.
Right. It's a non-starter because if you acknowledge evil, then you implicitly acknowledge good, and so you've just kind of self-defeated your own argument. Right. Yeah. David Wood actually was the one that taught me that one in a debate.
no
Back it up a little bit.
hit argument? Let's look at it more closely. Are these two statements logically inconsistent? No. Here is an example of two logical inconsistent statements. David can't be both married and a bachelor. But there is no explicit contradiction between these two statements. So there must be hidden assumptions behind this argument that would bring out the alleged contradiction. Here they are. If God is all-powerful, he can create any world he wants. And if God is all-loving, he prefers a world without suffering. So, if an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, it follows that suffering does not exist. Since suffering obviously does exist, the atheist concludes that God must not exist. But are the atheist's two hidden assumptions necessarily true? Consider the first assumption. Can God create any world he wants? What if he wants a world populated by people who have free will? It's logically impossible for God to force someone to freely choose to do good. Forcing free choices is like making a square circle. It's not logically possible. It's not that God lacks the power to perform the task. It's that the supposed task itself is just nonsense. So, it may not be feasible to create a world populated by people who always freely choose to do what is morally good. So the first assumption is not necessarily true. Therefore, the argument fails. And what about the second assumption? Is it necessarily true that God would prefer a world without suffering? How could we possibly know this? We all know of cases where we permit suffering in order to bring about a greater good. If it's even possible that God allows suffering in order to achieve a greater good, then we cannot say this assumption is necessarily true. For the logical problem of suffering to succeed, the atheist would have to show that it's logically impossible that free will exists, and that it's logically impossible that God has good reasons for permitting suffering. This burden of proof is too heavy to bear. It's quite possible that God and suffering both exist. This is why philosophers, even atheist philosophers, have given up on the logical problem of evil.
We can concede that the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another. Some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of a theistic God. No one, I think, has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim. It's now acknowledged on almost all sides that the logical argument is bankrupt.
But this is hardly the end of the discussion. We still need to explore the probability version of the problem of evil.
Which we just did.
John, I didn't get one of them. Atheists it's logically impossible that free will exists, and logically impossible that what?
God prefers a world without evil.
Okay.
So those are the hidden assumptions. So when they argue that it's logically impossible for both God and evil to coexist, there's hidden assumptions there that God can just create any world he wants, which isn't necessarily false. He's not saying that that's false, that God can't create any world that he wants. It's just saying that we can't be locked into this necessity that it's absolutely necessarily true that God can just create any old world he wants, even if that includes logical inconsistencies. I've had kind of a hard time with this one, but the conclusion that I've arrived at, because the question is, well, then what is logic that God obeys logic? I think logic is like goodness. It's an essential part of God's nature. So God abides by logic as part of his own nature. I think that God can, logically, he can create a person who has free will, who infallibly never chooses evil, always chooses good. But I think that would be something that only God can have. So essentially, if God did create a creature that has free will and perfectly always chooses good, that would essentially be equal to himself.
Mm-hmm.
Which I don't think he would do that. Because such a creature would have to have perfect spatial and temporal awareness. They would have to have, have no limitations in time or space in order to infallibly always choose good.
And I think that, just as Christ's example of that, he was God and he lived that perfect life, and yet he was condemned and criticized and ridiculed, because people didn't understand his goodness,
Right,
And
and his perfection.
I think Corey brushed on it a bit about having free will and value and choices.
Yeah, this morning.
Right, because without free will, is what you're doing. If someone does something really nice for you, they were out of their way, they didn't have to do it. It was really good and nice. Someone that they may love you or whatnot. Was that actually good? Is there any value in that, or are they forced to do that? So if we don't have free will to do it, is it actually valuable? Is there any meaning to it?
Is there any such thing as altruism?
Yeah.
This was the part you're talking about. It's logically impossible that God has good reasons for permitting suffering. So the atheist would have to show that it's logically impossible that God could have good reasons for permitting suffering. But like we saw in the second video, we must admit that we're not in any position to know with certainty that God doesn't have good reasons for this thing to happen. I mean, it might be hundreds or even thousands of years before the greater good is achieved as a result of God permitting some instance of pain and suffering.
One thing I want to go back to is something that was said in talking about C.S. Lewis, talking about God speaks to us through goodness and then shouts to us through suffering. There is, in one of the other pieces here in this book, that talked about the different kinds of suffering, and I think that we can avoid some of that suffering by listening closely and hearing God speaking through his goodness and through the without having to be shouted at. Now, we can't avoid all suffering through that, but certain elements of suffering we can avoid if we're willing to listen with the smaller things of
Oh yeah, absolutely.
the way God speaks to us.
You know how people wish for hindsight, right? There's so much suffering that you've been through that could have been avoided after the fact, that you knew the consequences of your actions, right? So yeah, most suffering is avoidable, but not all of it. However, because you suffered, you now know what you could have done to not suffer.
A greater good was achieved.
God gave us the ability to have free will. He did not give us the ability to know the consequences of those free will.
Yeah. One thing that I've heard that is kind of funny to me is they said wisdom comes from your mistakes or whatever you learn from your mistakes. But I kind of alter that with wisdom is learning from other people's mistakes.
Oh, yeah.
Because I don't have time to make them all.
Most paths in life are beaten paths. We can watch people make the same stupid mistakes over and over again, and I continue to. And not all of them. Right? It's like how Edison found 1,000 ways to not make a light bulb.
History repeats itself.
Or at least rhymes.
Yeah.
So this was a lot to talk about. I mean, we covered like 4 different arguments all on the same parent topic here. Do we want to choose a new topic for next week, or we can revisit this one and continue talking about the problem of evil and suffering?
You know, the one that just came to me, even though we talked about it, is intelligent, optimal, and divine design.
We covered that one, didn't we?
No. We covered evolutionary computation, we covered the origin of life, but we didn't do intelligent, optimal, and divine design. We did, yeah.
Let me see.
Which one is that?
20
And the question of
104?
science.
or 108, 21.
It's crossed out.
Yeah, we did. We did
did?
Intelligent, Optimal, and Divine Design by Richard Spencer. Yeah,
When did we do that?
that was 1, 2, 3, 4. Week 4.
Okay, I didn't have that marked.
Which was 4 months ago, October 8th. Yeah, it was October 8th.
Okay.
I probably missed that one too.
I don't seem to
I
have
don't
the outline.
think I was here
Almost left my outline.
that day.
We can do it again.
Yeah, we can recover it if you like.
Any other
Oh, I got
topics?
notes from it. Yeah, I've got notes from it.
Scott, any either of us, anything,
I don't think I'm gonna
anything
be
pop out you guys want?
Next time.
Looks good.
Weekend.
Yeah, I don't think I'm gonna be here.
You're not gonna be next week.
Like I said, I missed that one, so I wouldn't mind going.
Doing it again?
That's mine.
Okay. So we want to redo Richard Spencer's Intelligent, Optimal, and Divine Design.
Okay, so that'd be for March 3rd.
Well, that's less work for me
Yeah, I'm
because
definitely not gonna be here.
I've already got that one typed up. So.
Page 108. Well, then I'm gonna review my notes.
The
Be all
interesting-
prepared for it.
Well, I noticed that I'd written down a couple of videos that either John or Randy mentioned, or books, and, if they're videos, I'll look at them. If they're books, I won't be able to get to them. Probably, oh, here, Stephen J. Gould's The Panda's Thumb, and then I had a question mark by Adaptive Systems.
Yeah, I can start thinking of some of the different examples in Critique for Theory of Theological Evolution. I'll bring some from that.
The thing that I appreciate about fine-tuning argument is that the fine-tuning argument is like impossible to get around even with evolution. Like you don't even have to touch evolution, because like whether or not evolution is true or not has no real bearing on Christianity. But a lot of Christians see evolution as this threat that has to be addressed, and like, oh, we have to strike down evolution. It's like we don't even have to go to evolution. If you point to the fine-tuning argument, that's so much bigger and like so much harder to refute than evolution,
You know,
because
it's funny though, to me, it's.
I'm just saying you
I
can
have
avoid
trouble with
emotional
it because
charge.
of basically the anthropic argument, which is a cop-out. But
But there's a
it's-
solution to the anthropic argument, which is the the fly on the wall. And we talked about that in On Guard, which was like the anthropic argument, or the anthropic principle is the idea that we should not be surprised by the fine-tuning of the universe because we're here to observe it.
If it wasn't this way, then
Right.
it wouldn't be here, and so therefore it's a moot argument.
Right, exactly. So the firing squad analogy is in response to the anthropic argument, which says that imagine you've been arrested, you were on vacation, overseas, and you've been arrested for some silly crime that you never committed, but you've been sentenced to death by firing squad, and 100 trained marksmen all lined up, ready to shoot, and the command is given, fire, and all 100 trained marksmen shoot their guns, and you open your eyes and you're alive. What would your conclusion be? Would it be that, of course I survived, otherwise I wouldn't be alive to be surprised about it? There's no explanation needed. Or would you look at it and be like, how did 100 trained marksmen all miss?
Based on what I know about firing squads, they accidentally gave them all blanks.
Which would lead you to question maybe it was rigged. Maybe somebody made sure that they were all given blanks so that you would survive. The point is that for someone to hide behind the anthropic principle and say, well, of course, there's no explanation needed because if the universe were life prohibiting, there would be no one here to observe it. So of course, it's the same thing. Like if 100 trained marksmen shot at you and you lived, you would immediately conclude this must be rigged. Like this had to have been set up so that I would survive, because the chances of surviving 100 trained marksmen shooting all of them shooting at you is like inconceivable. You're gonna die. Like that's why it was a choice.
Words that don't mean what you think that it means.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's, I want to read the end of that critique. And you may remember some of them. The back section of it talks about, because the whole book is a critique on theological evolution. The end part of it is a theological portion, and if evolution is true, then it makes a liar out of, and it goes through the list of people throughout the Bible and things they say and the topics of God, and I was like, wow. I want to reread that.
Were you serious when you said if the Earth was 6 inches further or back?
It's something like that, but I've heard some kind of statistic that's like, if the Earth were just some tiny distance closer to the sun, we would all burn up, and if we were just some tiny distance further away from the sun, we'd all freeze to death. And people will look at that and like, wow, that's so crazy. Like, what are the chances that our Earth would just be delicately balanced in this perfect, distance from the sun but that's nothing compared to the fine-tuning of the universe. Like the number that Roger Penrose gives, that 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, that number is so large that if you wrote the 1 followed by all the zeros, there's more zeros than there are atoms in our universe. So like that, our universe literally cannot contain that number. The only way to write it is 10 to the 10 to the 123rd. Right, it can't be written any other way because our universe can't contain it. It's just so large a number, which means that, like you talk about the odds of winning the Powerball. The odds of winning the lottery are like 1 in some huge number, and it's like, why even buy a lottery ticket? Your chances of winning are inconceivably small. Your chances of winning the lottery are like amazing compared to the chances of a universe like ours. So that's why I like the fine-tuning argument, because you don't even have to step into the very emotionally charged arena of evolution. Not that evolution is true or false or whatever. Like I'm not even going there, but you don't even have to go there. Like that's the beauty of the fine-tuning argument, is you don't even have to go there, because the fine-tuning of the universe is just so compelling.
And one thing that I think of too, that beyond just a compelling argument, it just to me it just glorifies God and His wisdom and His understanding. That He he, had us in mind, and all of these constants had to be in place before the creation of the universe, and know the implications of every one of those to the infinite degree, and that is literally inconceivable.
There's
to the
something else
human mind.
that just occurred to me as you were saying that is, did it have to be that way? Like the fine tuning of the universe is so delicately balanced. It's like a razor, all these things delicately balanced on a razor's edge. Did it have to be that way? I don't know that it had to be that way. Nevertheless, it is. So that in its own, speaks elegance into the cleverness and the beauty of the design that our Creator put into our world. Because I don't know that it had to be that way, but the fact that it is that way is like, wow, that's incredible.
And I think too that to me, one of the books that I was reading on microbiology talked about at that level of microscopic world, everything is physics. Chemistry is physics. And so like gravitational constant and things like that would prohibit biology, would create and make impossible chemistry even. And that is just the implications are so vast.
Right. So when somebody says to you, well, there's so much pointless evil and suffering in the world, God surely doesn't exist.
I'm still stuck on that one.
Compare that to this enormously compelling argument of the fine-tuning universe. Not to mention, the Kalam cosmological argument and all those other arguments that we saw. It's like you're worried about the problem of evil and suffering.
I've always stopped at that door of logic before going down the argument of pointless suffering. What is pointless suffering? What suffering would have a point to it if God doesn't exist? It's also a non-starter.
Oh, right.
That's
Exactly. That's another good point. It's like,
what's the point of suffering?
Right.
If God isn't real, why?
I wonder if, given David Wood's background and how I've heard him debate, I wonder if that's the position he takes in God, Suffering, and Santa Claus, an examination of the explanatory power of theism and atheism, which is the very next essay after responding to the argument from evil. I wonder if that's his position.
Well, psychopaths think alike.
It's probably, pointless suffering isn't pointless unless there is a God.
Not just a bunch of non-starters, and that's why I think 98% of these arguments are emotional. Because if you're talking to a logical person, they wouldn't make this argument.
Yep.
The logical debate is the pit I've been living in, and it's kind of pointless because it only satisfies me.
I'm kind of in the same boat. Yeah. There are very few people that are truly logical, and even in my case, I revere logic very highly, and yet I still see a lot of emotional responses in my own life, and it's inherent in being human. And there's quite a continuum of logic versus emotion and how people respond to different aspects of that.
Yeah, he kind of takes it, not in such terms, but he says, the point here is that if atheists expect theists to take the denial of theism seriously, they must offer a hypothesis at least as powerful as theism. Yet atheism can't explain even the most basic facts about the world, hence there's clearly a double standard at the heart of the atheist's thinking. If we're going to reject a hypothesis because they fail to explain the data, we must reject atheism long before we reject theism, because they're not offering a substitute hypothesis. They're just saying, well, you're wrong. Okay, well then what is the solution? I don't have a solution. I'm just saying yours is wrong. That's not a good argument.
It feels like me trying to explain to my children that when they say it's not fair, you don't quite understand what fair means. But it's deaf ears.
Yeah.
It's not fair, cause.
Yeah.
That reminds me of what are you saying there? It almost on 26, the vice strategy, squeezing the truth out of Darwinists. It has some similar stuff. Actually, this one looks really good. It has different questions like, well, what do you mean by terms like science, nature, creation, design, and evolution?
Oh, you mean essay number 26, not page 26.
Yeah. Sorry.
I see. It's like my book doesn't match one.
And it's like it's almost like a dialogue style where they're like, well, let's ask them the questions about this and their response and explain your response and what do you mean by that, and that looks good too.
So do we land on intelligent, optimal, and divine design? Is that the one we landed on? Okay. Well, I'll send out a link. The essay is already there. It's ready to go. So I'll just send a link to the one that's already up there. We'll rediscuss that next week. Would anybody like to close this out in prayer?
Once.
Thank you. Father, you're so good to us. Lord, thank you for revealing your nature to us in such beautiful ways. Lord, I just pray that you would give us eyes to see things the way you see things. Lord, help us to recognize the difference when someone is struggling with the problem of evil and suffering. Lord, I pray that we would just see them through your eyes and we would care for them in a loving way and help them to see your truth, Lord, that things are the way they are because you designed them that way and you intended them to be that way. Lord, I just pray that you be with us this week and help us to recognize open doors to share your truth with others around us. In Jesus' name.
I just wanted to share just some good news. There's one guy in our that I work with that just came from just horrible upbringing, just unimaginable world for me, and a rough character, and he listened to rap music that just like hear some of the lyrics and like, oh my gosh, you know. And early last summer, he started listening to the Bible in his earphones at work, and he's a completely different man. It's just amazing to watch the transformation just from listening to God's word.
Wow.
You know, and we had a neat conversation on Friday, just talking about the differences in the way he views things, the way he relates to his family, the way just all these different aspects of his life. It's really cool. So it's been exciting to see that.
That's
Thank
fun.
you for sharing that.
Yeah.